So welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Foundation of a Radiation Safety Program. Our focus here is on nuclear sources, and my name is Tara Hargreaves. I am a staff scientist and the manager of training at the Radiation Safety Institute of Canada. I have been with the Institute for a little over 12 years and have been working on teaching people about radiation safety, and another thing that I do is assist people with license applications and developing of radiation safety programs for the CNSC license application. So in this session, we've got a simple focus here, but there are a lot of topics within this, is that we're going to focus on the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission licensing process, and we're looking at building your radiation safety program around that licensing process, so within the parameters of the CNSC license application. So with the CNSC licensing application process, we're looking at there are actually three types of license applications that are out there. So we've got Class 1 facilities, and that we're really looking at the very big facilities like the nuclear power plants and uranium mines. There are also Class 2 facilities where we're looking at accelerators that have energies between 1 megaelectron volt up to 50 megaelectron volts. So these would be many of the accelerators that we would see in hospitals, as well as irradiators and then other assorted equipment. And then we've got the nuclear substance and radiation devices application, and that's where we've got the vast majority of licensed sources. So I do have a couple of questions for us here. Okay, so somebody has just said, let me know that the poll is still showing. My apologies. I failed to click hide on that, so that is my fault entirely. Thank you for letting me know that. I much appreciate it. And hopefully now we can see everything properly. And I'll have to go back to putting that control panel away again. Okay, so thank you for letting me know that. Here we are, licensing process. Now we're into the slides. You didn't miss much. The previous one was just our outline, and we had our title slide. I do apologize for this, and we'll do our best to get through without too many more hiccups. So I'm going to open the poll again and hopefully remember to close it this time so that we can get on to the slides, but just wondering about what kind of license do you currently have, or if you don't currently have a license, what kind of license are you looking to apply for? So just out of curiosity there. So we'll give a few more seconds for people just to fill in their answers. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll and share our results there. So the vast majority of people fall into the nuclear substance and radiation device licenses, which is wonderful because that's what I would expect to see, since that's the vast majority of license applications and licenses that are out there. And then some people have said more than one of the above, which is common, and quite a few people have said that they don't have a license and they're not intending to apply for one. So interesting. Glad that you're joining us anyway, and hopefully you can throw in a comment later on to let us know why you decided to join us, and that's always a good thing for us to know our audience. So back to the presentation. So I'm glad to see that the vast majority of people, in fact, have a nuclear substance and radiation device license. I have to apologize, Class 2 people, you do get neglected a little bit. Because the nuclear substance and radiation device license is the most common one, that is in fact the one that I will be focusing on today. But that's not to say that if you have a Class 2 license that there's not some useful information here. I'm sure you'll find some good takeaway from this presentation. So one of the keys with the CNSC licensing process is to start off by getting all the forms, and that's easier said than done. The forms you can get from the CNSC website, and I will just quickly go out of this presentation so that I can show you the forms and where you can get them. Okay, so I'm flipping through things here just so that I can show you. I didn't want to keep this all in PowerPoint. I did want to let you know where you can find things. So you should see a website here, and any of this information, if you need links to the websites, I'm happy to find that for you. So you go on to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission website, and they have a site for the licensing process. And if you go through this, this will lead you to what you need. So new license application here that shows you where you can get the license application. And the CNSC, like me, focuses a little bit on the nuclear substance and radiation devices license application. They have the version of the application guide that you can download, as well as the license application form. So the information to guide you through the licensing process is right here on their website, including the process for submitting your license application. So you will notice that they have a mailing address and a fax number. In general, what people do is submit their license application by email. So that is really the easiest way to go about things. Okay, so I'll get us back to the PowerPoint presentation. So as I flip through presentations, you're just going to have to bear with me a touch to let the technology catch up. Okay, and I just want to make sure that I know what you're seeing before I minimize my control panel. Okay. I'm sorry, it skipped ahead here on me a little bit. So there we are. We have to get all the forms, and then when you start looking at the application form, that'll give you a guide to try and put together your radiation safety program. So that helps you to build the framework for developing your program, so you're not starting from ground zero. So just another question on the polling. I'm curious about how many people have personally helped develop a radiation safety program or helped put together the license application, has been involved in one or the other or neither, to see where we are here with the audience. Okay, looks like most people have voted. Give you just a moment more to put in your answers last minute, and I'll close the polling here and let's take a look at what people have said. So quite a few people have been involved in putting together the program and submitting the license application. And then our next group of people are ones who've been involved in neither. So this will be a lot of useful information for you. And then people who have done one or the other. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation now that we've got an idea of what people have been involved in. All right, so with regards to the license, we mentioned this and I've got the link up here. We've got the license application guide. That is an invaluable guide to you in developing your radiation safety program. It walks you through the license application form. It gives you a lot of information about where to get started in developing the different pieces of your program, the various policies and procedures, as well as putting the forms together. Just to mention as well, with the license application process, there are additional forms that you do need, things like the applicant authority form. So that's the authorization that your organization is authorized to apply for the license. So this is from perhaps the CEO or president of the organization will fill this out and acknowledge their role in the application. And then if you do rent your facility, then you need the landlord or owner of the building space to sign an acknowledgement form that is sent into the CNSC. So that is a big part of your package. And then in addition to the forms that you get from the CNSC, you will add your radiation safety manual as a big chunk of what you're submitting to the CNSC. A key thing to keep in mind with the license application and the license application guide, the CNSC keeps updating them, and the old versions continue to be available online. So it can be quite easy to download an old version and not realize that there's been a newer one. I would suggest going to the license process page that I showed previously, as the download there should hopefully be the most recent version. So if you're looking at the versions for the license application, you want the May 2017 version of the license application form. With the license application guide, you're looking at Reg Doc 1.6.1 version 2, and that was out April 2017. So the license application, the first two parts, Part A and Part B, are the basic information on who you are, what kind of application do you wish to have. And then when you get into Parts C, D, and E, that's where we're looking at putting together the radiation safety program. Okay, so the license application, the main parts that are going to be put into your radiation safety manual are prompts that come from parts C, D, and E. And so that's your radiation protection program. Part D, radiation safety program policies and procedures. And Part E is all the specifics that are to your license type. So you wouldn't fill out all of Part E, only the sections that in fact apply to you. So in developing your radiation safety program, you're going to be putting together a radiation safety manual. So one document that addresses all of the questions, policies, procedures that come about through your radiation source usage. So we get the headings for this program essentially from the license application, because those are the things that the CNSC would like you to address in your radiation safety program. The document can be quite big, so we're often submitting radiation safety manuals that may be between 20 to 100 pages, depending on the complexity of your organization and the use of your sources. So it all depends on what procedures you need to lay out in your program, how long the document will actually be. Oftentimes the RSO is the one that is asked to prepare the radiation safety program, and though there's nothing in regulation that says that that job is only saddled to the radiation safety officer, so you can get assistance with other people that are involved in the radiation safety program. You can also hire a professional consultant to either assist you in preparing the program, maybe reviewing the procedures if you're not confident in them, or to prepare it on your behalf and submit the full license application on your behalf to the CNSC. So if you find that time is not on your side, you can pass this off to somebody else. So a consultant is able to do that for you. So you can see there are a lot of elements within the radiation safety program, and that can be a daunting task. Now, the good news, if you are doing a license application for low-risk use types, which unfortunately is not most people, but if that is one thing you're doing, and to give you a few examples of low-risk use types, if you have XRF devices, so X-ray fluorescence devices that use a nuclear source, those are into the low-risk use type. Electron capture devices, check sources, teaching sources up to 50 megabecquerels. So there are a few different types of sources and uses that would fall into low risk. And in that case, you have to only fill out parts A of the license application, part B, and then part E.6, which is a very, very simplified version of the radiation safety program that allows you to basically agree to suggestions the CNSC makes. So I'm just going to take a quick look at the question pane to see if we've got anything that, that I need to address right now, and it looks like we're doing okay. All right, so I'll get to those questions again at the end of the presentation. Okay, when we look at one of the first things that the application asks for, it's the radiation safety organizational structure. So the CNSC is looking here for an organizational management chart. You can write a description of it, but a chart is really the easiest way to present this. So this chart that I'm showing here is just an example, and it can be a very simple organizational structure because it is only pertaining to radiation safety. So that is all the CNSC wants to see. So you may have quite a complicated organizational chart for the overall structure of your organization, but when we are applying for the license application and putting together a radiation safety manual, it's only the organizational structure as it pertains to radiation safety. The top of the structure should be the applicant authority, for sure, because that is the person who is signing off on the license application. Within the structure, we want to see the radiation safety officer, and we also want to outline where the radiation users are. Some key things is that the radiation users should report in some way, shape, or form to the radiation safety officer. So we want to see the radiation safety officer sort of above radiation users so that they can enforce radiation safety protocols. We also need to see added in a direct line of communication between the radiation safety officer and the applicant authority. So in this case, we've added that line in as a dashed line to indicate that the direct communication would be only in case of emergency. So we want to know that the radiation safety officer, if there is some sort of emergency, can go directly to the applicant authority to manage that emergency. Within your radiation safety manual, do try to avoid using individual names. So if you do want to put an individual's name to the position, I would suggest keeping the organizational structure as a separate document. The reason for that is when you submit your license application, if you wish to change, because say your radiation safety officer leaves, your applicant authority changes, if you want to change that organizational structure, you have to submit a new one to the CNSC. I should qualify there to say that if either of those positions change, you have 15 days to notify the CNSC of the change and who the new either applicant authority or radiation safety officer is. Avoid putting individual names, especially for people who might, or positions that might have quite a bit of turnover. So often the radiation users will not be listed by name in the Radiation Safety Manual, though you can have a separate document, and you do need to have a separate document which lists their names that is kept on record and can be shown and shared with the CNSC if needed. So the RSO has a big job, and part of the Radiation Safety Manual is to outline what the duties and responsibilities of the Radiation Safety Officer are. A good place to start with this is to go to the License Application Guide. So Reg Doc 1.6.1 gives some examples of what different jobs the RSO might do. So you'll want to head over to Appendix C of Reg Doc 1.6.1, and that'll list off quite a few duties that the Radiation Safety Officer is expected to perhaps carry out. Whenever you use the License Application Guide to help you develop the program, you'll want to make sure to tailor it to your specific use. So I encourage, and the CNSC is completely fine with you copying exactly from the guide, but you do want to tailor it to your use of sources. So if the guide suggests that the Radiation Safety Officer is responsible for monitoring contamination, but you only use sealed sources, you'll want to exclude that from the list of duties. Otherwise, it raises questions as to why your sealed sources are a contamination hazard all the time. So some key things that the RSO is doing is ensuring proper use of the sources, responsible for training staff, controlling the security and storage of the sources, and acting as a contact person for the CNSC. So this does not have to be every little job that the RSO does, but we want to capture the key and very important duties of the Radiation Safety Officer. And believe me, if your list is not complete and the CNSC sees a gap, they'll let you know and you can add that in there. So the License Application Guide is a great starting point for many of the sections that you want to have in your Radiation Safety Manual and in developing your program. So use that to get you started and get you going with any of the policies and procedures that you need to put together. Part of your program, and a big part of your program, is establishing an ALERA policy. So a commitment to keeping doses as low as reasonably achievable. With the radiation protection regulations, ALERA is laid out as an important part of radiation protection, and that recognition that there are radiation dose limits, but we don't want to just adhere to the dose limits. We want to stay as far below the dose limits as is reasonably achievable. So head over for some inspiration. You can, and all these guides that I'm mentioning are downloadable off the CNSC website. The easier way to find them quite often is to type CNSC and the guide name or number into a search engine, and that will take you directly to it. So the ALERA guide is G129 revision 1, keeping radiation exposures and doses as low as reasonably achievable. When you put together your ALERA policy, it doesn't have to be long and complicated. We're looking at maybe a paragraph here and just encompassing your commitment to keeping doses below the dose limits, but not just below the dose limits, as low as reasonably achievable. You'll also have to classify your workers, and this can seem like an intimidating task at times. So there is a guide here that doesn't necessarily seem like it would be helpful for classification of workers. G313, this is a training guide, but within this training guide and the Appendix A of this training guide, it does suggest some categories of workers that you'd want to consider. So you can look at your use of sources and the workers that you have who will be using the sources. You'll want to list by job title who those workers are. Remember to include the Radiation Safety Officer and any alternate radiation safety officers within the list of workers that you have that use radiation sources. But you're going to also need to add in any authorized users and what job categories and departments that they belong to. Are the users classified as nuclear energy workers? If so, why? If not, why not? The actual names of the workers will be kept on a separate record, so it will not be part of the radiation safety manual. When looking at classification of workers, we want to know, is anyone designated as a nuclear energy worker? You justify this through either a calculation of an estimated radiation dose for the worker that can be based on the dose rate you would expect in the areas where the worker would be working, and estimate the amount of time they would be there. In this calculation, you'll want to make it a worst case scenario because you do not want to underestimate a person's dose for the regulation for designation of the worker. The safest thing to do is to overestimate the dose. So make sure you do that. So calculation of a dose, or perhaps you've got a license renewal that you're doing and you already monitor workers using either an area monitor or individual dosimeters, and you can use those dose records to justify whether or not people need to be designated as nuclear energy workers. If you have designated people and you find by using dosimeters that people are below that 1 millisievert per year cutoff for nuclear energy worker designation, then you can justify using those dose records, taking people out of that designation, so not designating people as nuclear energy workers. Or you can use historical dose records to justify no longer using individual dosimeters. So those historical dose records can be quite useful for changing things at the license renewal time. The form for notifying a nuclear energy worker, you can get an example form in the license application guide. So Appendix D of Reg Doc 1.6.1. So you'll want to attach that form. You do not have to use the example form. It gives you, again, a starting point, and it lists the information that needs to be included in that nuclear energy worker designation, or notification, I should say. Training is a big thing that's come up of late, and is a very important part of your radiation safety program. So you want to have initially a policy stating that people who are going to be handling nuclear substances will only be authorized to do so after they have had training. So that's the key thing. A person is not to be permitted to use radiation sources until after they have received the appropriate training. You can have a clause to that which says that a person can work with a trained person, and that trained person then is responsible for that worker's safety with regards to the radiation sources. You need to lay out who your training provider is. So is it an internal worker? Is that person qualified? What makes them qualified to give that training? Is it an external agency that will provide training? If so, who are they? So what is the name of that agency? What course will be used? And if the CNSC is not familiar with the agency, they may want more information about the course that the agency will be providing. And a big thing, Don't forget refresher training. So this can get overlooked, but it's being overlooked less and less by the CNSC these days. So refresher training, there's nothing in the regulation saying how often it should be done or needs to be done. If you put it into your radiation safety manual that's used for your license application, then you must follow the timeline that you put in there. We recommend every 2 years. I've heard that there have been some recommendations out that every 5 years is sufficient. So pick what works for your organization, keeping in mind that whatever goes into your radiation safety manual is something that you are expected to do by the CNSC. So with worker training, if you do decide that you want to do training in-house, and some of the training you will have to do in-house for your specific procedures, for your specific location, to show people where things are and how to use them hands-on. So with developing your training, if we go to, there is a training guide G313. So that training guide we mentioned before to get us some help with classifying workers. Also in Appendix C has some sample topics for radiation safety training. So that can help you start to shape your program. And then you can also go to RegDoc 2.2.2, which actually goes through training theory, so how to put together effective training programs. So those two guides can be very helpful for developing your program. Things to consider: how will you deliver the program? Will it be online? Will it be in class? Will it be hands-on, on-the-job kinds of training? List what topics you will be covering. You don't have to put detail there, just the topic outline. So within, say, radiation safety principles, you don't have to outline time, distance, and shielding. You just have to put the topic there. And then what sort of assessment will be done? Is it an awareness program, so you'll have no assessment? Do you have a test? Will you require people to demonstrate their skills? So it might be using a radiation device, and they'll have to show that they are able to do so effectively. And don't forget the RSO. Radiation safety officer needs training, and the radiation safety officer needs to refresh their training as well, so that they are up to date on new CNSC regulations, new requirements, and to keep their memories refreshed for things that they may not do on a frequent basis. So we did talk a little bit with designating a nuclear energy worker about figuring out people's doses. So you do have to put in your procedures for calculating or recording individual workers' radiation doses. So we might estimate doses by a calculation, show your work, let the CNSC know how you got to your numbers, or you may base the dose estimates for workers on historical dose records. So you may have a range based on what the highest dose anyone received in any quarter might have been. There you need to also justify using those calculations whether personal dosimeters will be used to monitor workers. So our cap there, I shouldn't say cap, lower limit, 5 millisievert per year. If anyone is possibly going to reach that, they would need to be monitored with a personal dosimeter. If the dose is expected to be well below 5 millisievert per year, then it's up to you whether you want to have them monitored or not. So you can opt to, but you are not required to have the workers monitored. If you put in your radiation safety manual that you submit with your application that dosimeters will be used, even if they're not necessary, then you must use the dosimeters unless you make a change to your program with the CNSC. If dosimeters are required to be used, you need to name the service provider that you will be using, and they need to be licensed with the CNSC. The application also asks about action levels. These are included. They should definitely be part of your radiation safety manual and your radiation protection program. most people don't require action levels. So within the license application guide, it really outlines that those using industrial radiography cameras must have action levels. We find action levels usually in high-risk situations like nuclear power plants and in some hospital situations. Now, a lot of license applications do not include action levels. If you do decide to set action levels, do not set them too low. So you want to have a reasonable level, and an action level could be a dose, could be a contamination level. It's anything that will help you be warned of a problem with your radiation safety program. And you want to make sure they are not exceeded on a regular basis. So they're showing you a problem, not the regular use of your sources. So do set them high enough to not be regularly exceeded, but low enough to alert you to an issue with your program. If you have open sources, then you will need to outline the control of contamination. Do not put procedures for contamination control with sealed sources. That will cause the CNSC to wonder if you know how your sources work. Yes, in an accident or emergency, a sealed source could cause contamination, but on regular daily basis, there should be no contamination from a sealed source. So this is for open sources. Things you want to consider here are frequency of the monitoring, what areas will be monitored, recording of the results, and what are acceptable levels. So for information on this, you're going to want to head to RegDoc 1.6.1, that license application guide, and that will be Appendix BB. So that outlines things to consider for controlling contamination. It also gives the contamination limits that are allowable by regulation. And if you also head to Appendix W of the license application guide, that shows a sample of a log for contamination monitoring. You need to have a radiation detection instrument. If you have open sources, you may need a contamination monitor. For all sources, there needs to be a survey instrument available in case of emergency. So let's put into your manual the instrument that you have, and that way people will be able to look up the instructions for how to use that instrument. You're also going to need to outline calibration, how often it will occur. A hint there that for survey instruments, that calibration is going to be done every 12 months, as is required by the regulations. You'll need to name the service provider for your calibrations, and the wording here we want to have is that the service provider follows the expectations of the CNSC as outlined in Appendix Z of RegDoc 1.6.1, the License Application Guide. The CNSC does not license or approve calibration services, so that is why we have that wording of showing that they follow the expectations of the CNSC. Similar thing occurs with leak testing. So we need to name the service provider that will be used for leak testing and indicate that they follow the expectations of the CNSC as outlined in Appendix AA of RegDoc 1.6.1. So leak testing, let them, in your manual, you should state whether or not it's necessary. So if you have sealed sources with an activity of 50 megabecquerels or more, then leak testing needs to be done. If it's less than that, then you can justify not doing leak tests. The frequency of the tests for sealed sources, every 6 months you need to do a leak test. If that sealed source is in a radiation device, then the leak test is less frequent at every 12 months. So here's a big one, access control and security. And this is a big one because there are new requirements that are mandatory for all licensees as of May 2018. So you have a little less than a year to ensure that you are following the requirements in Reg Doc 2.12.3. So the requirement here is that this must be complied with by May 2018. So that's likely requiring you to submit to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission an updated security policy and procedure. There is a frequently asked questions page online for Reg Doc 2.12.3. So you can head over there with some questions. Feel free also to ask your licensing specialist with the CNSC for assistance on that, but do get that document and ensure that you are in compliance with it. So depending on the classification of your sources, and this is for sealed sources, that document, depending on the classification of your sources, you may be required to ensure that your workers have criminal name background checks. So those would have to be done by any worker who has access to the radiation sources, so unsupervised access to the radiation sources. So that's a big part of what that document is requiring. For all radiation source users, open, sealed, you need to have security procedures and access control. So a statement that authorized users are the only ones to have access to the sources, and how are the sources secured? So are there guards on the premises that prevent outside individuals from getting into the workplace? So only workers are able to be on site. What locks do you have? So are there locks on the case? Are there locks on a cupboard? Are there locks on the door? Who has access to the keys or codes to ensure the sources are secured? And if they are taken off-site, how will sources be kept secured off-site as well? Because you do have radiation sources, in the very least with transport procedures, you need to have something about receipt of packages. So outlining who is permitted to receive radiation sources or a package with radiation source. Is it going to a general package receipt area, or is it going specifically to a radiation safety officer or other worker? Do you have anyone transporting sources? Because then we need to make sure that people are appropriately trained and that there are specific transport procedures for the sources. If you will be shipping sources, who is permitted to package those sources and what procedures will they follow for shipping? If people are packaging, receiving, or transporting sources, unless they are accepted packages, those individuals will require transportation of dangerous goods certificates, and that's a Transport Canada requirement, and that should be within your radiation safety manual as part of your radiation safety program, and also show a sample of your shipping document. So you can head online to Transport Canada's website, and they have a sample shipping document for dangerous goods, but it will have to be modified because it's meant for the other classes of dangerous goods, and radiation sources require different information there. So do modify that based on the CNSC's packaging and transport of nuclear substances regulations. So what is required to be in that document. We need to ensure that we know what radiation sources we have on site at any time. So that's really the inventory of the sources. You can find sample inventory forms in the license application guide, Reg Doc 1.6.1. Appendix T and Appendix U give samples of inventories for sealed or unsealed sources. You also need to document when sources leave your facility, so waste and disposal needs to be documented as well. This can be done paper or electronically. List in your radiation safety program your use and storage locations of your sources. So they may be two different places, they may be the same location. If you're within a building, you may be specifying the room where sources are used and the room where sources are stored. The sources should never be located in any place that is not listed as a use or storage location in your radiation safety manual. That is a key part of making sure that we keep track of the radiation sources and avoid losing them or having them stolen. So if the location isn't listed, the source is not permitted there. If you wish to add locations to your license, you'll need to get an amendment for that. If you do have portable sources that you will use, but you're not sure where your clients are located, narrow it down. Is it potentially countrywide? Okay, you could list all of Canada. Or is it within specific provinces or one specific province? So list exactly where you expect. So you could say throughout Ontario, you could say in Alberta and BC, you could say throughout the entire country. You will need to be sure to post signs if necessary. So when is it necessary to post those radiation warning signs? If you've got a nuclear substance 100 times the exemption quantity or more. So where do you find this information? Well, there is a guide on radionuclides, and I'll try and pop that up momentarily, and that actually outlines a lot of the exemption quantities for sources, but you can look those up in the Nuclear Substances and Radiation Devices Regulations. Schedule 1 will tell you what the exemption quantities are for your sources. The radiation dose rate, if it may reach 25 microsieverts or more, then you need to post a sign as well. So this is an either-or scenario. If your source falls under either of those categories, you must post the radiation warning sign. And also don't forget to outline that you will also not only just be posting this radiation warning sign, but also the emergency contact information that's required by the Nuclear Substance and Radiation Devices Regulation. So who is to be contacted in case of emergency. That can be a security phone number or a central phone number, but of course, who needs to ultimately be contacted in case of emergency is the radiation safety officer. Emergency procedures need to be laid out, and most often you're not expected to detail exactly what will be done in case of the worst scenario you can come up with. So this is not what you need to put in these procedures. What needs to be in the emergency procedures is mainly initial emergency response. So if there were a large spill of source, if there were a fire at the location, what is to be done in the initial response? Key things: notification of the radiation safety officer, calling emergency responders, and then of course notifying the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which is something that needs to be done immediately. With that immediately, you can put in as soon as it is safe to do so. The CNSC will be called, and that will of course be their 24-hour duty officer phone number. You'll also have information about area evacuation, how far around the source. So maybe it's going to be 5-meter diameter around the source that you need to evacuate. If it's a fire, evacuation from the building. Obtaining a radiation survey meter to keep track of dose rates and ensuring that where anyone goes, that the dose rates are not at a hazardous level. And then of course monitoring for any contamination that might result. So with this type of thing, especially if you've got something like a nuclear gauge, you can pop online, download Working Safely with Nuclear Gauges, a CNSC guide, and in that guide, page 28, it outlines emergency procedures, so you're not on your own in trying to develop these procedures. And I realize I've got a few more slides here, bear with me, and I realize I'm running out of time, but If you know me at all, you know I'm a talker and that I never stick to timelines. So I apologize if you have to leave because you've got an appointment at 2 o'clock, but you'll be able to catch up in the recording afterwards. So if you've decided that you no longer want your sources, you need to have procedures for decommissioning. Even if you're not doing it right now, you're applying for new sources perhaps, this is still part of your initial radiation safety program. So how will you ensure that these sources are safely disposed of? That might be using a licensed disposal facility and then monitoring the area for any residual contamination, making sure that isn't there, and sending off this form to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to say that you no longer have the sources and no longer wish to have the license for those sources. You also need to detail what records need to be kept, what reports need to be made. So when is a report required? In cases of, say, a fire or a large spill, unusual incidents. So when do you require a report? Exceeding a dose limit is another instance there. So you'll want to reference the regulations and where reports are required, what records you're required to keep. So things like worker dose monitoring, contamination monitoring, training records. Where will they be located? So they can be kept online as an electronic file in the radiation safety officer's office, and how long are they meant to be retained? The CNSC has a handy record retention document. So head over to a search engine, look up CNSC record retention document, and you will see a chart there that outlines all the records that you are required to keep and for how long. So that's quite a handy thing to have there. If you have unsealed sources, make sure to classify your laboratory rooms as basic, intermediate, high-level containment, or nuclear medicine. So the requirements for that are outlined in these posters that, again, you can download from the CNSC's website. And you'll definitely have to have a procedure for conducting internal reviews. How often will a review of the radiation safety program be done? Needs to be done once every year, but in between that time, you'll need to do periodic inspections to ensure that people are complying with regulations. So that should be written as a policy in your radiation safety manual. And then the last part of the license application has to do with the specifics of your use type. So the specifics there, so things like nuclear medicine, if it is therapeutic or diagnostic, if you've consolidated use of license or industrial radiography, gauges, servicing or manufacturing sources. These will all have very specific items that don't pertain to all license types, so you'll have to outline more information there. And again, for guidance, head to the application guide document 1.6.1. And another handy way to get some assistance is to Google other people's radiation safety programs. Some manuals are online, and you can get your inspiration from procedures that somebody else has already put together. So some tips for putting together your radiation safety program. That license application guide is a great template. Do copy from it. You can copy from it exactly. The CNSC does not mind you plagiarizing their stuff. So the license application guide, other CNSC guides, use them to help put together your policies and procedures. If you have the radiation device operating manual, you can refer to that. You can use that to help put together your procedures. They will often have procedures for leak testing, for maintenance of the devices, for cleaning and usage of the devices. Look for radiation safety manuals online that are similar to your use of sources, and you can use those for inspiration. Just make sure you tailor everything to your specific use. And always feel free to ask the CNSC questions. They don't mind if you ask them questions about how to put together good procedures for radiation safety. They can be very, very helpful to you, and they prefer that you're trying to get it right, and they don't see someone asking questions as someone not knowing anything and not being qualified. Quite the opposite, they see it as somebody trying to do the best of their ability. So I've put in some websites for resources specific to finding CNSC publications, regulatory documents, TDG information. So these websites, I'm sorry that they're a bit long, but you'll have to copy them into your browser and you can find some great information there. And if there's anything that you missed or anything you're trying to find that you can't find, do send me an email. I'll be happy, of course, to help you out. So thank you very much for listening. I do apologize for going slightly over, but that's just the way I am and you'll have to accept it. Our toll-free line, website, and general information email are on the bottom of this slide. We're always happy to help out. If you have any questions that arise from this presentation, do send me an email. If you don't already have my email address, the easy one to take down is th@radiationsafety.ca. So for anyone that has to pop out, I thank you for attending this webinar, and I hope you got something out of it. And for everyone who is able to stay just a few more minutes, I'm going to look at the questions that have been submitted and see if there are answers I can give you right now. Okay, so for anyone who has to pop out, thank you for coming, and I do apologize for going a little bit long. For everyone who can stay, I'm happy to continue asking questions, or sorry, answering your questions. Okay, so just give me a moment as I go through. Okay, so I have a question here. Does the landlord acknowledgement form have to be updated every time the license is updated? It is part of the license application question. Oh, I'm sorry.